Welcome, everybody, to our second webinar of this academic year, From Konkan to Coromandel, Deccan Heritage, Art and Culture, a collaborative webinar organized by the Deccan Heritage Foundation, the Center for Islamic Studies at the University of Cambridge. Sorry about that. That is one of my co-organizers, Helen. The Museum of Art and Photography in Bangalore and the Bangalore International Center. And we're really delighted to have this multinational collaboration to support and link various communities in the study of Deccan art and architecture, really to sort of go beyond just sort of sectarian or very narrow groups of this world and open it out to various traditions. So today we're delighted to host Professor Sidh Losa Mendiratta from the University of Cumbria. Sidh Losa Mendiratta holds a PhD in architecture from the University of Cumbria and is a researcher in the Center for Social Studies, University of Cumbria. Since 2012, he holds the chair of history of Portuguese architecture in the Department of Architecture of Lusafona, University of Porto. Specializing in cultural heritage of Portuguese art in South Asia, he has conducted 27 geo-reference topographic surveys of archaeological sites in India in collaboration with the Archaeological Survey of India. We would also like to thank Professor Julia Egevald for bringing Dr. Mendiratta's research to our attention. Today, Professor Mendiratta's lecture is entitled "A Missionary Enterprise, Old Goa's Christian Religious Architecture, 16th through 18th Centuries." So without further ado, I welcome Dr. Mendiratta.
Thank you. Greetings to all. I will share my screen first of all. And I hope now everything is all right with the PowerPoint. Firstly, I would like to thank the Deccan Heritage Foundation and partner institutions for this invitation to talk on Old Goa, and of course, thank Professor Julia Egevald for bringing us together. This presentation today, this talk, builds on work of previous researchers and will focus on the Christian religious architecture of Old Goa, the erstwhile capital of the Portuguese Estado de India. So the presentation is, the talk is divided into 5 parts, where I will first lay out the basic facts of Old Goa's history, and then I'll talk a bit about sacred sites, and then about church typologies, and then I will focus on the 4th section on one particular church, and then finally, if there's time, I would like to address the issue of the ruin and dismantling of Old Goa briefly, I think. The work previous researchers have done regarding religious architecture, Christian religious architecture in Goa, we can say that started more or less in the 1950s, when a team of researchers funded by the Portuguese government started to look into these buildings in the larger issue of building a notion of Indo-Portuguese culture and society as a peaceful coexistence between a colonizer and a colonized situation, which has, of course, its unique features. And this team, which visited Goa in 1951, then they published some books and they organized some exhibitions, which actually took place in Europe, in some of the capitals of Europe, and attracted some attention. And of course, this was all financed by the Portuguese government at the time, which was a colonial and nationalistic government, as you know. More recently, two scholars have looked at this topic in depth, and of course we have the PhD done by Professor António Nunes Pereira in a German university, in Aachen University, I think, and published his book in 2005. And of course we have the work of Paulo Varela Gomes, who lived in Goa and studied Goan architecture, Goan culture, and of course he taught at the University of Coimbra in the architecture course. So I will look at some of the ideas of these two authors today. So Old Goa was, of course, a large metropolis which flourished for about a century under Portuguese rule, from 1510 onwards, and then had a very long, slow but decline and abandonment, which led to it almost disappearing. I mean, for the exception of a few buildings, it disappeared as a city. It's important to recognize when we look at the central part of the state of Goa, and we focus on the island of Tiswadi, where we see that the original capital or the medieval capital of this region was in Govapuri, which is also known as, in Portuguese sources, as Goa Velha. That means the old city, the old capital, and that it shifted from this area to the north, to the river Mandovi in 1469. 1470, and this was due to the influx of a new population from Kerala, from southern India, from Hanava, and these were traders and a community of traders who found that the shores of the Mandovi River were better equipped to repair and build ships, vessels. So the city of Old Goa really starts to flourished in 1470, around 1470, and then of course it is conquered by the Portuguese in 1510. Once it starts to decay, there's the idea to build a new capital and enlarge the fortifications of Mormugao, just across the river in the Sidh province, South Goa. And of course, there was a new city being built here, which was not completed, a project which was also abandoned around 1720. So finally, the capital of Old Goa shifts to where it is now, to Panjim. And since 1843, officially, this is the capital of before of the Portuguese state of Goa, and now of the state of Goa itself. So these four sites are very deeply connected, and these three, Govapuri, Goa, and Panjim, share a lot of building materials which have circulated from one city to the other through the centuries in a kind of a recycling spirit of building materials. Old Goa reached its peak around 1590 under the Portuguese administration, and that's the image we see here by the Dutch traveler Linschoten from 1595, more or less. And Linschoten was a spy who was spying for what would then become the Dutch East India Company, and his depiction of Old Goa is one of the most important visual documents we have for this period of the biggest development of the city. Another very important document, a bit 3 decades later, is the view from Pedro Barreto Rezende associated to him, which has a different kind of geometry and interpretation, which looks much more naive, but it's also nonetheless a very, very important visual document, which we will also talk about. Regarding church architecture, very briefly, to introduce the main buildings, which the Portuguese started to build around 1510, around the main one, which was Sea Cathedral. And Sea Cathedral was built right at the center. And then all these churches, smaller churches and chapels, they were built around them. And here at the very center, one can see the old city, the Islamic city, the pre-Portuguese city, the walls of that city. There was a wall and a moat here. So some of the churches and chapels were built inside, and then very quickly, as the city expanded, many other churches were built outside. And this area is the maximum urban and suburban area, if one can say. The limit between the urban and the suburban area was not at all clear for Old Goa. And then we have the religious orders, which were actually responsible for a lot of the economic development of the city, because Old Goa was the gateway towards missionary enterprise all over Asia. It was a base from where religious orders would coordinate and centralize their missionary enterprise and their missionary activities, and where they all would have their mother houses in Asia. Of course, this follows the idea that the Portuguese king had a large responsibility in organizing and had a patronage, royal patronage of the missionary activities, so that he had a lot of privileges in that Catholic missionary activity. So first we have the Franciscans, who established their mother house and a college, and then the Dominicans, who also established their mother house of St. Dominic and a college. We have the Jesuits, which established 3 separate buildings in 3 separate parts of the city. And then we have the Reformed Franciscans, which settled slightly in the outskirts in this area, but which had a big impact in other places of Goa and the Portuguese state of India. And then we have the Augustinians, of course, which have a convent, college, and a seminary. And we have the Carmelites. The Carmelites are particularly important because they don't fall directly under the Portuguese patronage. They are working directly from Rome, from the Propaganda Fide system. And then we have the Theatines, who come a bit later in the 17th century. And then we have the Brothers of St. John of God. And then finally we have what we call a native Goan order, which are the Oratorians, which established themselves in the Miraculous Cross Church down here, and they follow the order of Saint Philip Neri. This is just an overview of some of the main religious buildings of the city. These are not all of them. There would have been many more chapels and hermitages, but these are the main buildings. Regarding the appropriation of sacred sites in Old Goa, this is a very important aspect of how the Portuguese religious system, the religious orders and the secular clergy, they both appropriated sacred sites in the city. And this, of course, had various motives, and we will look at them in a little while, but it's important to focus on how we can find clues also, and how we can find evidence of this appropriation, wherein we can say that some churches in Old Goa are multi-layered sites, which probably have, or definitely have, pre-Portuguese ruins or artifacts buried beneath them. So, for example, in the early 18th century, there was a small excavation near Sea Cathedral, right at the center of Old Goa, in order to build a little extension to Sea Cathedral. The building is here. And while this extension, the foundation works were being done for this extension, there was found an artifact which was described later by the dean of the cathedral himself, Bravo Moraes. And this artifact, by the description, closely resembles another religious artifact in the temple of Tambisurla in northern Goa. And the same source from the 1730s that this dean of Sikh Cathedral is writing, that right after they found this artifact and others, they buried them where they were, and that little extension to Sikh Cathedral was built and finished, and so probably they are still at the same place. Of course, here we see the larger picture, where besides Sikh Cathedral, which is this building here, which became Sikh Cathedral a bit later, that huge building that is still there today. So there's a very strong possibility that this Sikh Cathedral was built over the ruins, what I think were the ruins of a Hindu temple. But we have more precise information that the Franciscan church, they basically, their first years or their first mass, the first couple of years they were using a reconsecrated mosque, which was the main mosque of the city of Goa when the Portuguese conquered it. We also know, for example, that there are strong indications that there was another temple later on when another church was built, where the Theatine Church was built. Of course, the main building of Old Goa, pre-Portuguese Old Goa, was the Palace of Adil Shah, which was first transformed into a viceroyal residency, and then it became the building of the Inquisition in the 1550s. We have other indications of temples of a Hindu goddess, where the Church of Our Lady of the Mount is, and another temple in a tirtha in another, next to another church. And then, for example, we have the issue of pre-Portuguese Christian artifact, which was found in 1512 right at the center of Old Goa, and was the Portuguese obviously were very interested in finding pre-Portuguese Christian artifacts and traces in India, that they were actually obsessed with that. And so this artifact was sent right away to the king in Portugal, and on its place a chapel was built, which was later abandoned, and that road, that street, became known as the Holy Crucifix Street. So this is the image of the Church of St. Francis, and the painting done in the 1940s, where the mosque was supposed to be. So there's this idea that the mosque was then transformed after becoming a church. It was transformed into the refectory of the convent, of the Franciscan convent. And then we have this very interesting aspect of the reuse of stone. So we find that in many churches and gardens and areas, the religious Christian sites reused artifacts from Hindu or Muslim structures. And so here the issue of spolia, why these elements were reused, it's not so much as to symbolize admiration for the pre-Portuguese cultures or architecture, or to use them as trophies. It's more an issue that in Goa, the main building material was laterite, which is a stone which is very hard. It's very soft and very difficult to work if you want to do an elaborate ornamental stone, for example, ornamental artifacts. So for that, you need a different kind of stone. Laterite is actually a rock which is very porous. And so you need something like basalt or granite. And you get very little of that in Goa. So the Portuguese reused elements from Hindu temples. And here you see, for example, the two sides of a sculpture from a Hindu temple, I gather, and which was switched around and chiseled into an architectural element of church. The same thing here. This is a pillar, part of a Hindu temple, which was converted into a baptismal font. And of course, if you go elsewhere in Old Goa, you find even more examples of Muslim tombstones simply converted into Portuguese tombstones. This part here, Portuguese tombstone, probably came from north, from Gujarat. And here you see part of a pillar of a Hindu temple, which was converted or used by the Portuguese as their pillory, a symbol of justice. But we have other examples, and many of them seem to come from one particular place, which was one of the earlier churches, which was called Nossa Senhora da Serra. And at this moment, I would just like to say that I'll be mostly using the Portuguese names for churches, their invocations, which are sometimes not very easy to translate. So Nossa Senhora da Serra was built by one of the first Portuguese governors, Afonso de Albuquerque, also to be his mausoleum. So he was entombed there he was buried there for about 40 years, and then his remains were shifted to Portugal. But in building this church, Afonso de Albuquerque definitely used a lot of artifacts from Hindu and Muslim structures. And then his statue was placed at the facade of the church, and then it had a kind of a strange story. It was also circulating around, going to Panjim and other places, and then finally now it is at the ASI Museum in Old Goa. And of course, we come to the most famous example, which is known as the Adil Shah Gate, which is a false ruin, actually, and it's artifacts from a Hindu temple, probably from Divar Island across the Mandovi River, with cement structures, and then a Portuguese lintel here from another structure. And these were all glued together in the 1920s, I guess, because if we look at a photograph from 1906, we see that the place where the Adil Shah Gate stands now, I mean, there's nothing, it's empty fields. And also, if we read Lopes Mendes, who was a Portuguese, a veterinarian and a writer and an author, who wrote extensively on Old Goa during the 1870s and 1860s, he says that he was the one who found these stones, these pillars or these door jambs, and actually put them upright in a certain place. So anyway, Adil Shah Gate was classified as a national monument by the Portuguese in the 1930s, and so it remains a national monument today. I would like to talk a bit about church typologies. I'm not very fond of the word typology, but the basic kind of structures architecturally that the Portuguese built during the first couple of centuries that they were in Goa, in India. And in doing so, of course, my main reference is the book by Paulo Varela Gomes, Whitewash Red Stone, where Gomes identifies 6 or 7 typologies in order to reach then to where he wants to. His main argument is how the Goan church was built. And in saying Goan church, Goan Christian architecture, he makes the case that it is a unique expression of Christian religious architecture, which is not really the fusion of India and Portugal or Indo-Portuguese art or culture as was previously portrayed, especially during the 1950s, 1960s. So in these typologies, we start with the typology of the tower over the narthex, so the westward tower facade. And these were some of the earlier churches built in Old Goa, including the Sea Cathedral, the second version, rebuilt in 1525, which was also, the invocation was Saint Catherine, because Saint Catherine was the patron saint celebrated in the day in which the Portuguese conquered the city. But also some of the older churches, Our Lady of the Rosary and Our Lady of the Light, were built with this tower over the facade. And of course, only the Rosary Church stands today, and it's a beautiful church, and it's it's been studied, researched quite a bit, because it's in fact the only manual line church. Manual line means it's the only church which relates architecturally to the kingdom of King Dom Manuel I, which reigned for the first 2 decades of the 16th century, and which was responsible for preventing the Renaissance entering into Portugal until he died. So there's this very clear idea and conception that as soon as he died, all the artists and especially architects were very tired of his particular style, which we call Manueline style, which is a kind of late Gothic language in architecture and art. And so they were very eager to start applying the classical revivalist spirit, which was coming from Italy for so many years, and which many Portuguese, erudite Portuguese had already heard about or had already seen. So actually the Rosary Church, although it has this typology and although it has Manueline features, it also has certain Renaissance classical architectural features, or classic revivalist, if you. The second type, which Gomes identifies, are what he calls the one tower, one nave churches. He actually calls them the island type. So the island in the sense of the main island of Goa, Tishwadi, and then in the center, Divar, Shurão, etc. So these are very, very simple churches, and they were originally covered in thatched roofs, and that is probably why all of them have these very steep gables in the facade, because the roofs were very steep, because most probably they were built out of thatch originally, and so because of terrains that they had to be with that inclination, with that angle, so that they wouldn't become so heavy with water, with rain, that they would collapse. And actually these churches, they were built also in other areas of India where the Portuguese were present. And so here in Goa, most of them have been transformed, but one can still identify them with their basic features. We have another very interesting typology, which is a central plan structure. And this was developing during the early 16th century as the Renaissance started to have a more larger, stronger impact in Portugal and in the Portuguese Empire. Unfortunately, most of these central plan structures, which were usually smaller chapels and hermitages, they were later transformed, and they became they became rectangular structures with the additional of more volumes. And so this are three examples, but they have all well, a couple of them have disappeared, and of course the example of Saint Anthony near Saint Rosary is still there, but this church was transformed into a rectangular church. So it originally was a circular structure, and then it was transformed and became a rectangular church. So as we move along the 16th century, the mid-16th century, and as the Renaissance and the classical revivalist spirit in arts and culture starts to affect Portugal, we have the large three-nave churches. Now these are three naves, which was a common typology or a common solution for Romanesque and Gothic churches, but these churches have already in their facades and their interiors and in their language, they have a classic revivalist approach. So we have the Dominican church first, 1550, then we have the Jesuit church in 1560, and then of course we have the largest sea cathedral, which was built from 1557 onwards, which was only completed about 75 years later. So it took a long time to complete. Regarding the Dominican church, the ruins have almost completely disappeared. There's some artifacts, some stones lying from where the chancel used to be, but we have to understand, try to figure out how it was, its architecture, through visual documents and through descriptions also. So we know it was a very large church with three big naves, and we see more or less an idea of the facade in the top drawing over there, and also in the drawing by Lopes in the late 19th century. Sea Cathedral is obviously the largest one and one of the largest buildings built during the Portuguese, by the Portuguese in anywhere, anytime. It was, I think, for a while, the largest church in Asia, in some way or another, but it's not anymore, definitely. And here you see the three-nave solution being used. And of course, the church is missing one of the towers, which collapsed in the late 18th century. And this also relates to the use of laterite as a building material, which the Portuguese soon found out had a lot of problems, caused a lot of problems for them, especially when they started to build bigger vaults for the churches. It was before the sea cathedral, which was supposedly the first church which had two symmetrical towers in the facade. One already had a tower with that particular typology in Diu, which was the Church of St. Thomas, which, although it was not a cathedral, and the two symmetrical towers in the facade at this time were only reserved, were only allowed for cathedrals, for the seat of the bishops. But here in Diu, in the north, in Gujarat, we have this exception of the Church of St. Thomas. Of course, the church, the sea cathedral, took 7, almost 8 decades to be built. But today, together with the Church of the Franciscan Church, dominates the central area of Old Goa as it's seen today. Regarding the Church of St. Paul, this is almost everything which is left, which is visible to the naked eye. And this is a very small fragment of its facade. This was the first Jesuit church built outside of Europe. The Jesuits had a small temporary church here in Old Goa, but it was not really, they built it already knowing it would be a temporary church. So they started building this church in 1560. And it's one of the very first, or probably the first large Jesuit church outside Europe. And it's also one of the few Jesuit churches which had 3 naves. I believe that the Church of St. Paul in Macau also had 3 naves, but I'm not exactly sure. Anyway, this church, there are a few visual documents relating to it which don't really add up. This is on the left is a watercolor by an English officer from the early 19th century when the British were occupying Goa. And here you see the depictions by Bret Rezend and Lynch Rotten. So they don't really add up. And I think what I propose is that this facade, which you see here in the early 19th century, was not the 16th century facade. It was actually, there are documents which show, not visual documents, but written documents which state that the Jesuits rebuilt the facade in the late 17th century, early 18th century. So how was the original facade of this church? Well, I propose that it was of a very uncommon solution with a circular pediment over the main facade and with round openings. And we get an idea of how this church might have been if we look at the Jesuit church, for example, in Pasai in the north, which was built about 10 years later. And here one can see, or one can argue, that the church in Pasai was following very closely the church in Goa, which was the capital and which was actually the mother church of the Jesuit order. And this makes sense then if one compares with the other visual documents from the 16th and 17th century. So what could have been the influences for such a design? Well, the main one would have been the Miracoli church in Venice, built in the late 15th century. But we have other examples. For example, this project, which was not built, but this design by a church, by an architect in France, Jacques Perret, from the early 17th century. So this church was very uncommon, and in Portugal, there are no examples of such solutions for the facade, at least. Now we move on to single nave churches, and this became a big difference in Old Goa when the Portuguese decided to stop building 3 naves and start building 1 nave. And this, of course, is connected to the Council of Trent, which convened in the second half of the 16th century, and which said that churches should be very clear and open spaces from where the faithful could concentrate and focus on the mass and on the liturgy, and shouldn't have dark corner spaces where different things could be going on, which the priests wouldn't be able to control. Excuse me. So here we have 3 main churches, single nave churches, and as you can see, the largest one, which is the Augustinian one, has 2 towers in its facade. And this was one of the main features which the Augustinian order decided to implement even before Sidh Cathedral was being built. So until that moment, 2 towers in the facade were reserved for the seats of the bishops, and the Augustinian order very boldly, courageously decided, no, we want a big church with 2 symmetrical towers. The other 2 churches are the second Jesuit church of Pont Jesus, which was started a few years earlier. And then we have a 3rd church, which is the Carmelite church, which I'll be talking a bit more later on. So this is the famous second Jesuit church, Pont Jesus Church of the Professed House, started in 1595. And of course, today, all the whitewash, the whitewash coating which the church had over the laterite has been removed. It's still one of the very surprising churches in the whole Portuguese area of influence all over the world. And of course, we also have to try to imagine it with the original votive cross, which was destroyed, unfortunately, and with a whitewash of lime applied to most of it, but not to the central areas of the facade, which were again built with granite from a region near Mumbai. So the Jesuits were in control of a big quarry near Mumbai, and they had access to all this very good granite, but not all the other religious orders had this possibility. So they used this granite to do very fine carving ornamentation on the facade, which has been associated to one particular architect called Júlio Simão, and both Nunes Pereira and Paulo Varela Gomes see, of course, North European Flemish influences, especially from Flemish treatises on Renaissance motives and architecture. The Augustinian Church, Our Lady of Grace, Nossa Senhora da Graça, again, -1 tower, which had already collapsed by the time this photograph was taken, builds the first large vault made out of laterite. So, of course, Sidh Cathedral had vaults, also barrel vaults, but this one has the first large barrel vault along the whole nave, single nave church. When the Portuguese start building these barrel vaults with coffers as becomes standard during the Renaissance period for churches, they realize that laterite is very dangerous, and usually the barrel vaults will crack open at one point. So that's also why one sees today so many churches with buttresses in Old Goa. It was to prevent the barrel vault from cracking open, This is the survey which I conducted in 2004 in the ruins of Our Lady of Grace. And here you see the huge barrel vault with the coffers along the nave and then also along the chancel. This was one of the few barrel vaults which didn't give issues, which was okay, and which there was no need to build buttresses to buttress it, but it was an exception. And finally, the church I would like to address closely is the missing Carmel, Our Lady of Mount Carmel, Nossa Senhora do Carmo, which is the 3rd church which I had in that selection. This church was built from 1620 onwards, and both Nunes Pereira and Paulo Varela Gomes didn't access the site, and they couldn't gauge the full dimensions and the full significance of the site, of the ruins of this church in the context of the architecture of Old Goa. So this is how the site looked about 10 years ago when I was there for the first time. And this is how the site looks, well, a couple of years ago, when the Carmelites celebrated their fourth centenary for 400 years of arriving or of having a house in India, having a convent in India. Besides the ruins, we have to look at visual documents, and especially important is the drawing by Losa from the 1860s, which you see here below. And here you see, if one looks closely, one sees what one calls a barrel vault with penetrations, or a barrel vault with openings over the chancel. And if one looks at another photograph from the 1890s, it is apparent that the barrel vault was over the whole of the nave. So this is a bit of the barrel vault with openings in the chancel. And if one looks closely at this area, one sees that the barrel vault also had openings all along the nave. So one here for the first time in Goa is used a barrel vault with penetrations over a large nave. So this kind of vault has a lot of advantages, and the main one is that it's lighter, so it doesn't have so much volume. It very much reduces the weight on the walls. And since laterite was giving so much problems to the Portuguese builders when they wanted to build these large barrel vaults, the fact that this barrel vault with penetrations was much lighter was a very, very important matter. And also for the heat. So if one would open the windows, which would be at the topmost area of the vault, this would allow the hot air to circulate outside, and so it would cool the churches down. And one notices when one visits, for example, Sidh Cathedral in Old Goa, which doesn't have this kind of vault, that it can get really hot and stuffy inside. The third main advantage is light. And of course, this goes to also the idea of the Council of Trent and the Counter-Reformation of having a lot of light inside churches. Churches should have a lot of light, and they should have openings. And this, of course, was always something which in Italy and during the Renaissance period was very much sought for, but in Portugal was a bit slow. And actually the barrel vault with penetrations never had a lot of, during the 17th century, it didn't have a lot of impact in Portugal, only much later. And was it normal to make large churches with such vaults? So what I propose is that the Carmelite church, built in 1620, was the first church in Goa to have this kind of barrel vault, and that this barrel vault with penetrations was very, very important for the evolution of the following churches. This is a reconstitution of the facade, and of course this work was done with my colleague, architect Fernando Velho, and who also found a layout plan of the church itself. Here the image is not very good, but I hope soon it will be better once we shift it to AutoCAD. And here we see this two important aspects here are the double pilasters and the colossal order by which the pilasters are framing two levels of openings, or sometimes three, but in this case two, and these elliptical oval-shaped false openings here. And I will argue also that this is the first time in Goa that these three elements were used in a facade also. Where did this design come from? Well, it's of course we have the Carmelites in Spain and Italy with churches which look somewhat similar. Of course, they're very far away, so, and they also evolved in a different way. But I believe that the main influence was, of course, the Church of Il Gesù in Rome. So the mother house of the Jesuits, built from 1568 onwards, which actually had, I think, a direct impact on the Carmelites, but in Portugal had a slower impact, or had a different impact. but it was a revolutionary church in many ways, especially because of the barrel vault. The barrel vault with penetrations here was much different originally than what it is now, because it had, in the late 17th century, there was a full-fledged campaign with frescoes which changed the whole barrel vault. Originally, the barrel vault of Il Gesù was white with openings, so it provided a lot of light. And this must have had a strong impact, together with, of course, the dome. So this was the main influence for the Carmelite Church. And here we see, of course, the plan of Il Gesù with the intercommunicating side chapels and the dome, single nave, etc. And here we see the original barrel vault with penetrations without the frescoes. So it was a wide surface, and there's actually a painting also which shows that even better. So what was the impact of the Carmelite Church on Goan churches? And this is important because of the debate, let's say, started by Paulo Varela Gomes, of trying to identify what are the essential features or distinguishing features of the Goan church. So I just very simply say that the first church to be impacted by the Carmelite Church was the Church of the Holy Spirit in Margão, in Sidh. And this was built right after the Carmelite Church was finished. It was rebuilt, actually. There was a primitive Jesuit church there, and this was rebuilt from the 1640 onwards. So the main feature here, again, is the barrel vault with penetrations, which in my view would have been very, very closely modeled on the one of the Carmelites. And in the facade, we see the colossal order, double pilasters, and adopting the double tower symmetrical pattern from the Augustinian facade. So in a certain way, we can also argue that the Holy Spirit Church of Margão can be the first Goan church, although the solution of the colossal order here for the facade was not used, was not adopted by later churches. Anyway, we have then the reform of the sacristy of the Bom Jesus Church with the beautiful barrel vault with openings and highly ornamented. So this sacristy was actually rebuilt at the same time that the area where the body of Saint Francis Xavier is also kept, the burial place. There was a big reform of the whole Church of Bom Jesus, and this sacristy, which was built from 1652 onwards, I also argue was very influenced by the Church of the Carmelites, as was the rebuilding, or the building actually, of the Blessed Sacrament Chapel, which is an addition during the 1650s, to the Sea Cathedral, which also has barrel vaults with penetrations. And of course, the rebuilding of the Franciscan Mother House Church in the 1660s with its two double vaults. So the main nave with its barrel vault penetrations, it's a huge vault. And then the sacristy, which was also rebuilt, also has this kind of vault. Of course, at this time, the Theatines were building their very famous centralized planned church with their beautiful dome. The dome was the first of its kind to cover a large church, full dome with a lantern and openings, etc. So one also has to understand what was the impact of this building on the ongoing works, because this building started a bit later than the others. But this would be a topic for to compare. But I argue that this Theatine building comes later, and it doesn't impact. It's not the main source of influence over the barrel vaults and other issues of the Goan Church. And of course, then this would be the two first Goan churches as identified by Paulo Varela Gomes, Santana in Taualim and Nossa Senhora da Piedade in Devar, which incorporate all those issues. So one of the arguments I make is that the Goan Church is fundamentally has three main influences. For the facade and for the single nave, the Bom Jesus and the Augustinian Church, and for the barrel vault and other ornamental features, the Carmelite church. Well, I would like now to talk about the abandonment of Old Goa, but I think I've already talked for very long, so maybe I will pause now and maybe stop sharing and give the word back to Dr. Vivek.
Yes, thank you, Sidh, for that lecture.